The morning of June 6, 1944, brought with it the sound of steel scraping against sand, the metallic clink of connecting sleeves being threaded together under fire, and the desperate whispers of men who knew they held the key to breaking through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. In the gray dawn light off the coast of Normandy, combat engineers crouched behind the twisted wreckage of landing craft, assembling lengths of pipe that would either blast open the path to victory or explode in their faces. These were Bangalore Torpedo's 5-foot sections of steel tube packed with 9 pounds of explosives each, designed 32 years earlier by a British captain in India who had grown tired of men dying to clear obstacles. Now, as machine gun fire raked the beaches and mortar shells exploded in the surf, these simple devices represented the difference between Allied soldiers pinned down on the sand and the liberation of Europe. But the story of how a metal pipe filled with TNT became the weapon that cracked open Fortress Europe begins not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the dusty garrison town of Bangalore, India, where Captain R.L. McClintock of the Royal Engineers faced a problem that would plague armies for the next century: how to clear deadly obstacles without getting killed in the process. Captain Robert Louis McClintock had seen enough men die unnecessarily. Attached to the Madras Sappers and Miners Unit of the Indian Army in 1912, he spent his days dealing with the lethal aftermath of 2 recent conflicts, the Second Boer War and the Russo-Japanese War. The battlefields were littered with booby traps, unexploded shells, and intricate wire obstacles that required sappers to crawl forward under enemy fire, wire cutters in hand, snipping through barbed entanglements one strand at a time. The mathematics of obstacle clearing were brutal and simple. A typical barbed wire entanglement stretched 15 to 20 feet deep, with multiple rows of stakes driven into the ground and connected by hundreds of yards of wire. Each strand had to be cut individually, requiring a sapper to remain exposed to enemy fire for 10 to 15 minutes per gap. With machine gun crews specifically tasked to target obstacle clearing teams, casualty rates among engineers often exceeded 60% on contested ground. McClintock understood that the core problem was proximity. Every conventional method of obstacle clearing required men to get close enough to touch the wire close enough to be shot. Hand grenades lacked the concentrated blast needed to clear a useful path, typically managing to cut only 3 or 4 strands before their fragments scattered ineffectively. Rifle fire could snap individual wires but took too long and revealed the shooter's position. Artillery could clear wire, but required massive concentrations of shells and often left craters that blocked the very paths they were meant to open. What McClintock envisioned was elegantly simple: a long metal tube that could be pushed into an obstacle from a safe distance, packed with enough explosives to clear a meaningful gap, and detonated remotely. The tube would channel the explosive force in a linear pattern, maximizing the destructive effect against wire while minimizing the amount of explosive needed. More importantly, it would allow engineers to work from cover, reducing casualties and increasing the speed of obstacle clearing. His first prototype consisted of a single section of iron pipe, 5 feet long and just over 2 inches in diameter. The pipe walls were thin enough to fragment completely when detonated, but strong enough to be pushed through soft ground and tangled wire without buckling. He filled the central cavity with a mixture of TNT and amatol, an explosive compound that provided both high blast pressure and good fragmentation. The key innovation was the threading system. Each pipe section could be screwed together with standardized connecting sleeves, allowing engineers to create assemblies of varying lengths depending on the obstacle they faced. Testing began in the scrubland outside Bangalore, using captured wire obstacles and dummy positions. The results exceeded McClintock's expectations. A single 5-foot section could clear a gap approximately 10 feet wide through standard barbed wire entanglements. 2 sections connected together could breach obstacles up to 20 feet deep, creating paths wide enough for infantry squads to advance in column formation. The fragmenting steel pipe sections proved devastatingly effective against wire, slicing through multiple strands simultaneously, while the concussion wave cleared loose debris and partially buried stakes. More significantly, the weapon could be employed by a 2-man team operating from a covered position 30 to 40 feet away from the target obstacle. One sapper would assemble the required length of pipe while his partner provided covering fire. The assembled torpedo could then be pushed forward by hand or using improvised tools, positioned against the obstacle, and detonated using a standard military blasting cap and safety fuse. Total exposure time for the team dropped from 15 minutes to less than 2 minutes. Word of McClintock's invention spread quickly through the British Army's engineering community. The Bangalore Torpedo, as it came to be known, offered a solution to one of the most persistent problems in modern warfare. By 1914, the device had been formally adopted by the British Army and was being manufactured in small quantities for engineer units throughout the empire. The timing proved fortuitous. Within months, the outbreak of the First World War would create battlefields dominated by wire obstacles on a scale McClintock had never imagined. The Western Front became a 400-mile-long network of trenches, dugouts, and wire barriers, with some entanglements extending more than 100 yards deep and incorporating thousands of individual obstacles. The Bangalore Torpedo, originally designed to clear scattered post-war debris, found itself thrust into the role of primary obstacle-breaching weapon for an entire generation of soldiers. British forces used the weapon extensively during the Battle of the Somme in 1916, where Bangalore torpedoes cleared crucial gaps in German wire that allowed attacking infantry to reach enemy trenches. The weapon's effectiveness was limited by its linear blast pattern. It could only clear relatively narrow paths, but it proved invaluable for creating specific breach points that could be exploited by concentrated attacks. The success at the Somme led to increased production and refinement of the weapon. By 1917, British factories were manufacturing thousands of Bangalore sections monthly, with standardized dimensions and threading that allowed sections from different manufacturers to be used interchangeably. The weapon had evolved from McClintock's improvised prototype into a sophisticated engineering tool that could be mass-produced and distributed to frontline units. American observers studying British tactics took careful note of the Bangalore torpedo's effectiveness. When the United States entered the war in 1917, American Expeditionary Force engineers were trained in the weapon's use and employment. However, large-scale American adoption would wait until the next war, when the lessons learned from Normandy's beaches would prove the enduring value of McClintock's simple but revolutionary idea. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood on the windswept beaches of Normandy in December 1943, studying the tide line through his field glasses and calculating angles of fire. As Hitler's newly appointed Inspector General of Coastal Defenses, Rommel had been tasked with transforming the Atlantic Wall from a propaganda symbol into an impregnable barrier. What he saw troubled him. The existing fortifications were impressive massive concrete bunkers, heavy artillery positions, and intricate minefields, but they suffered from a critical weakness. They could stop an enemy who reached the high water mark, but they did little to prevent that enemy from landing in the first place. Rommel's experience in North Africa had taught him that the key to defeating an amphibious assault lay not in fighting the enemy once he had established a beachhead, but in destroying him in the surf before he could organize. The beaches themselves had to become killing grounds, forcing landing craft to approach through predetermined channels where they could be systematically destroyed by concentrated fire. This required obstacles, thousands of them positioned to channel the enemy into carefully prepared kill zones. The field marshal's vision was both simple and terrifyingly effective. The beach obstacles would form 3 distinct belts, each designed to stop or delay different types of assault craft. The outer belt, positioned near the low tide mark, would consist of heavy steel and concrete barriers designed to hold the bottom plates of landing craft and prevent them from reaching the beach. The middle belt would incorporate anti-tank obstacles and wooden stakes topped with mines, positioned to destroy any vehicles or craft that survived the outer barrier. The inner belt, closest to the seawall, would be pure anti-personnel defense. Dense networks of barbed wire, razor wire, and concertina obstacles designed to trap infantry in the open where they could be destroyed by machine gun and mortar fire. But Rommel understood that obstacles alone were insufficient. Each barrier had to be integrated with the defensive fire plan, positioned to force the enemy into areas covered by German weapons. More importantly, the obstacles had to be numerous enough and dense enough to prevent the enemy from simply going around them. This would require a construction program of unprecedented scale, involving tens of thousands of workers and millions of tons of materials. The numbers were staggering. Along the 50-mile stretch of Normandy coastline that Hitler considered most vulnerable to invasion, Rommel's engineers calculated that they would need approximately 11,000 major beach obstacles, ranging from massive concrete tetrahedra weighing several tons each to simple wooden stakes topped with anti-tank mines. Each obstacle would need to be precisely positioned according to tide charts and artillery firing data, then connected to neighboring obstacles with wire, mines, or other barriers to prevent gaps from being exploited. The construction effort began in earnest in February 1944. German engineers, supported by thousands of impressed laborers from occupied countries, worked around the clock to emplace obstacles along the invasion beaches. The outer barrier consisted primarily of what the Germans called Hembauten massive steel and concrete obstacles designed to rip open the hulls of landing craft. These included the hedgehog obstacles borrowed from Czechoslovakian anti-tank defenses, pyramidal steel structures 6 feet high with multiple projecting spikes that could punch through steel plate up to 3 inches thick. Element C barriers, originally Belgian anti-tank gates, were modified for beach use and positioned to create choke points where landing craft would be forced to cluster. These 10-foot high steel frameworks could be moved and repositioned as needed, allowing German defenders to close off cleared channels or redirect assault craft into new kill zones. Each Element C gate was reinforced with steel cable and often rigged with anti-personnel mines that would detonate when the obstacle was moved or disturbed. The wooden stake obstacles proved more challenging to install but were ultimately more numerous. German construction teams used high-pressure water hoses to blast holes in the sand, then drove 10-foot wooden posts deep into the beach substrate. The water hose technique, developed by troops at Neuchâtel Hardelot, could emplace a stake in approximately 3 minutes 15 times faster than using pile drivers or manual digging. By April 1944, German work crews were installing more than 300 stakes per day along the Normandy beaches. Each wooden stake was topped with a teller mine, a flat, disc-shaped anti-tank mine containing 11 pounds of TNT. The mines were positioned to explode on contact with landing craft, destroying not only the vessel that struck them but also showering adjacent areas with steel fragments and wooden splinters. Rommel calculated that a landing craft striking a mine stake would be completely destroyed, while nearby vessels within a 50-foot radius would suffer significant damage to their hulls, engines, and crews. The wire obstacles formed the most complex element of Rommel's beach defense system. Unlike the massive concrete barriers or explosive top stakes, the wire entanglements were designed not to destroy the enemy but to delay him long enough for German gunners to achieve decisive effects. The wire barriers began at the high water mark and extended inland for distances ranging from 50 to 200 yards, depending on local terrain. The German engineers employed multiple types of wire obstacles, each designed for specific tactical purposes. Concertina wire, manufactured in coils 4 feet in diameter, was stretched between stakes to create barriers that would expand when disturbed, entangling personnel and equipment. Razor wire, a more recent development, incorporated sharp steel blades at regular intervals along the wire strands, making it virtually impossible to cut by hand without specialized tools. Barbed wire, the standard military obstacle material, was layered in multiple rows and often electrified using portable generators. The most sophisticated wire obstacles incorporated what German engineers called surprise elements, booby traps, mines, and other devices designed to kill or wound personnel attempting to clear paths through the barriers. Tripwires connected to hand grenades were positioned to detonate when wire cutters were used. S-mines, designed to spring 3 feet into the air before exploding, were buried beneath wire entanglements and rigged to detonate when the wire was disturbed. Some sections of wire were rigged with explosive charges that could be detonated remotely by German defenders when enemy personnel were observed working on the obstacles. Rommel's assessment of Allied capabilities was remarkably accurate. Intelligence reports indicated that British and American forces were training extensively with specialized obstacle clearing equipment, including explosive charges designed to blast paths through wire barriers. German technical intelligence had identified the Bangalore Torpedo as a primary Allied obstacle breaching weapon and had captured several examples during raids on British training areas. Understanding the Allied approach to obstacle clearing, Rommel designed his wire barriers to specifically counter the Bangalore Torpedo's linear blast pattern. Instead of single, deep wire belts that could be breached by 1 or 2 torpedo detonations, German engineers created multiple parallel wire lines separated by 20 to 30 feet. Even if Allied engineers successfully breached the first line, they would immediately encounter a second line, then a third, forcing them to repeat the dangerous obstacle clearing process multiple times under fire. The positioning of German defensive fires was carefully coordinated with the obstacle plan. Machine gun positions were sited to provide interlocking fields of fire across all wire obstacles, with particular attention to likely breach points where paths might be cleared. Mortar positions were registered on predetermined target areas where Allied forces would be forced to cluster while working on obstacles. Artillery forward observers were positioned with clear views of all obstacle belts, ready to call for immediate fires on any breach attempts. By May 1944, Rommel's obstacle construction program had placed approximately 80% of the planned barriers along the Normandy beaches. The outer belts of anti-craft obstacles were largely complete, with nearly 9,000 major barriers positioned between the low and high tide marks. The wire obstacle belts were approximately 70% complete, with the densest concentrations focused on the beaches that German intelligence identified as most likely landing sites. But Rommel understood that obstacles were meaningless without adequate forces to defend them. The field marshal's persistent requests for additional infantry, armor, and artillery had been only partially met. The 7th Army, responsible for defending the Normandy sector, had been reinforced with the 352nd Infantry Division, but overall troop strength remained well below Rommel's requirements. More critically, the German forces lacked adequate reserves to counterattack if the Allies succeeded in breaching the obstacle belts. The field marshal's greatest concern was timing. Intelligence reports suggested that the Allied invasion was imminent, but poor weather in early June had led many German commanders to conclude that no assault would be launched for several weeks. Rommel himself had departed for Germany on June 4 to celebrate his wife's birthday and to personally appeal to Hitler for additional panzer divisions. When the invasion finally came on June 6, Rommel's obstacle system performed exactly as designed but not quite well enough. The outer barriers destroyed or damaged dozens of Allied landing craft, forcing many assault waves to approach the beaches in dispersed, disorganized groups. The wire obstacles successfully channeled Allied infantry into predetermined kill zones, where German machine gun and mortar fire inflicted heavy casualties. But the obstacles could not compensate for German weaknesses in air cover, artillery support, and mobile reserves. More critically, they could not prevent individual Allied engineers from getting close enough to the wire barriers to employ their Bangalore torpedoes effectively. Staff Sergeant Frank Draper of the 299th Combat Engineer Battalion crouched in the bottom of landing craft mechanized 174 as machine gun bullets sparked off the steel ramp above his head. The 24-year-old former construction worker from Detroit had trained for 8 months in England, practicing obstacle clearance until he could assemble a Bangalore torpedo blindfolded. Nothing in that training had prepared him for the reality of Omaha Beach at 0730 hours on June 6, 1944. Around him, 11 other engineers checked their equipment one final time. Each man carried specific components of what the Army called a gap assault team, the specialized unit tasked with blasting a 50-meter gap through the German beach obstacles to allow follow-on forces to land safely. The team's equipment included 8 Bangalore torpedo sections, connecting sleeves, blasting caps, safety fuse, wire cutters, and enough explosive charges to clear a path through the most heavily defended section of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Draper's team was one of 16 gap assault teams assigned to Omaha Beach, each responsible for clearing one specific section of obstacles. The plan called for the teams to land with the second wave, 15 minutes after the initial infantry assault, when the beach defenses had supposedly been neutralized by naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. The reality was somewhat different. As LCM 174 approached the beach, Draper could see that the German positions were very much intact and extremely active. The landing craft scraped against a submerged obstacle 200 yards from the beach, tearing a gash in its bottom plating. Seawater poured through the gap as the craft's engines strained to push forward through the surf. The Navy coxswain, 19-year-old Petty Officer 2nd Class Anthony Castellano from Boston, fought to maintain steering control as German machine gun fire raked the water around them. 30 seconds, Castellano shouted over the noise of engines and gunfire. "Get ready!" Draper and his men formed up behind the ramp, each engineer carrying approximately 60 pounds of equipment. The Bangalore torpedo sections, each weighing 13 pounds, were distributed among the team members to ensure that the loss of any individual would not prevent the team from completing its mission. The connecting sleeves, blasting caps, and other demolition materials were carried in waterproof bags designed to protect them during the landing. The ramp dropped at 0732 hours, and Draper's team plunged into 4 feet of cold water. German machine gun fire immediately swept the landing area, and 2 engineers were hit before they reached the beach. Private Thomas Kozlowski from Chicago took a bullet through the lung but continued forward, clutching his waterproof bag of blasting caps. Corporal James Mitchell from Alabama was hit in the shoulder but managed to drag 2 Bangalore sections onto the sand before collapsing. The beach at Easy Red Sector was a chaos of disabled landing craft, scattered equipment, and wounded men. The preliminary bombardment had failed to suppress the German defenses, and machine gun positions in the bluffs above the beach commanded clear fields of fire across the entire landing area. Mortar shells exploded regularly in the surf, and German artillery fire was beginning to range in on the growing clusters of men and equipment. Draper quickly assessed the situation. His team had lost 2 men and was scattered across 50 yards of beach. The German obstacles were exactly as intelligence had predicted, 3 distinct belts of barriers extending from the low tide mark to the seawall. The outer belt consisted primarily of steel hedgehogs and concrete tetrahedra, many of which had already been damaged or destroyed by landing craft. The middle belt incorporated wooden stakes topped with mines and various steel obstacles. The inner belt was pure wire, multiple lines of barbed wire, concertina wire, and razor wire extending approximately 100 yards inland from the high water mark. The immediate problem was that Draper's team was pinned down by machine gun fire approximately 50 yards short of the wire obstacles they were supposed to clear. German gunners in Widerstandsnest 68 had excellent observation of the entire beach and were systematically engaging any group of soldiers that attempted to move inland. Several other gap assault teams were in similar situations, unable to advance to their assigned obstacle belts. Draper made a command decision that would be repeated by NCOs across Omaha Beach throughout the morning. Instead of waiting for the situation to improve, he would adapt to circumstances and accomplish the mission with whatever resources were available. Crawling from man to man under fire, he consolidated his surviving team members and began moving laterally along the beach toward a damaged landing craft that offered some concealment. The movement took nearly 20 minutes and cost the team another casualty. Corporal Mitchell, already wounded, was hit again while dragging Bangalore sections across the sand and had to be left behind at a medical aid station established in the lee of a knocked-out Sherman tank. This left Draper with 9 effective team members and 6 Bangalore Torpedo sections, enough to clear a gap, but with no margin for error. The approach to the wire obstacles required the team to cross approximately 75 yards of open beach under direct observation from German positions. Draper coordinated with the crew of a disabled tank destroyer that had managed to land despite taking several hits from German anti-tank guns. The TD crew agreed to provide covering fire with their 50 caliber machine gun while the engineers advanced to the wire line. The movement began at 0815 hours and immediately drew intense German fire. 3 engineers were hit during the first 20 yards, but their teammates continued forward, dragging the wounded men and the precious Bangalore sections toward the wire obstacles. Private First Class Robert Hennessy from Boston was killed instantly by a machine gun burst, but managed to push his Bangalore section forward before falling. Staff Sergeant Eugene Washington from Georgia took shrapnel in both legs from a mortar round but continued to crawl forward, carrying blasting caps and safety fuse. Reaching the wire obstacles, Draper's team discovered that the German barriers were more sophisticated than their training had suggested. Instead of a single belt of wire that could be breached with 1 or 2 Bangalore torpedoes, they faced multiple parallel lines separated by 20 to 30 feet. Each line incorporated different types of wire obstacles, and many showed evidence of booby traps and concealed mines. The first wire line consisted primarily of concertina wire stretched between wooden stakes. Draper's team positioned 3 connected Bangalore sections against the obstacle and prepared for detonation. The torpedo assembly was 15 feet long and contained 27 pounds of explosives, enough to clear a gap approximately 10 feet wide through standard wire obstacles. Private Daniel O'Sullivan from Boston, the team's demolition specialist, connected the blasting cap to the Bangalore torpedo's firing system and prepared a 60-second safety fuse. The fuse length was critical, too short, and the engineers might be caught in the blast. Too long, and German defenders would have time to target the breach point with mortar or artillery fire. "Fire in the hole!" O'Sullivan shouted, igniting the fuse. The engineers took cover behind a knocked-out landing craft 30 feet away and waited. German machine gun fire continued to rake the area, and mortar rounds exploded in the surf behind them. The Bangalore Torpedo detonated at 08:27 hours, sending a column of smoke and debris 50 feet into the air. The blast effect was exactly as designed. The three connected sections fragmented completely, sending steel splinters through the wire obstacles and clearing a gap approximately 12 feet wide. Smoke and dust obscured the breach point for nearly 2 minutes, providing temporary concealment from German observation. But when the smoke cleared, Draper could see that they had only breached the first wire line. 2 additional lines of wire obstacles remained, each requiring separate clearance operations. The team had 3 Bangalore sections remaining and 6 effective personnel, barely enough to complete the mission if everything went perfectly. The second wire line proved more challenging. German engineers had positioned S-mines beneath the wire obstacles, and the first Bangalore detonation had triggered several of these devices, creating additional craters and debris that complicated the clearance operation. More seriously, the German defenders had now identified the breach point and were directing concentrated fire at the area. Draper decided to employ the remaining Bangalore sections simultaneously against the second and third wire lines. This would require his team to split into 2 groups and advance under fire to 2 separate positions, but it would minimize their exposure time and complete the clearance operation more quickly. The assault on the second wire line began at 08:45 hours. Private First Class Anthony Benedetto from New Jersey led 3 engineers forward, while Draper personally handled the Bangalore Torpedo for the third wire line. Both teams came under immediate fire from German positions that had been previously silent, suggesting that the defenders were revealing concealed positions to stop the breach operation. Benedetto was hit by machine gun fire while positioning his Bangalore Torpedo but managed to complete the setup before collapsing. The detonation at 08:52 hours successfully cleared the second wire line, but Benedetto died from his wounds before he could see the results of his work. Draper's simultaneous attack on the third wire line was also successful, clearing a gap that connected with Benedetto's breach to create a continuous path through all German wire obstacles. The total time required for Gap Assault Team 12 to clear their assigned obstacle belt was 1 hour and 27 minutes. The cost was severe. 5 engineers killed, 4 wounded, with only 3 unwounded survivors. But the mission was accomplished. By 0900 hours, Allied infantry were moving through the gap in squad and platoon strength, and the first vehicles were beginning to traverse the cleared path. Draper's experience was typical of the Gap assault teams at Omaha Beach. Of the 16 teams assigned to the beach, 13 successfully cleared their assigned obstacles, but at a combined cost of 52 killed and wounded, a casualty rate of 41%. The Bangalore Torpedoes performed exactly as designed, clearing precise gaps through wire obstacles that would have been impossible to breach by other means under fire. But the success of individual teams like Draper's could not overcome the broader tactical problems at Omaha Beach. Many infantry units had been scattered during the landing and were unable to exploit the cleared gaps. German resistance was far stronger than anticipated, and the beach was becoming congested with damaged equipment and casualty evacuation operations. By mid-morning, some senior commanders were considering abandoning the Omaha Beach assault entirely. The turning point came when surviving Gap assault team members began coordinating with individual infantry leaders to plan concentrated attacks through the cleared obstacles. Staff Sergeant Draper, despite being one of only 3 unwounded engineers remaining from his original 12-man team, spent the rest of the morning guiding infantry squads through the breach his team had created and helping to clear additional obstacles using improvised methods. Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kurabayashi stood in the entrance of Cave 17 on Mount Suribachi, studying the approach beaches through a German periscope. The date was February 15, 1945, and intelligence reports indicated that the American invasion fleet was only days away from launching its assault on Iwo Jima. Unlike his German allies defending the beaches of Normandy, Kurabayashi had no intention of stopping the Americans at the waterline. His strategy was far more sophisticated and ultimately more deadly. The Japanese general understood that any attempt to prevent the American landing would fail. The Imperial Navy could no longer contest American naval supremacy, and the handful of aircraft remaining in the Bonin Islands were insufficient to seriously disrupt an amphibious assault. Traditional beach defense tactics, which relied on defeating the enemy in the surf, were simply not feasible given the overwhelming American advantages in naval gunfire, air support, and assault troops. Instead, Kurabayashi had developed what he called defense in depth with calculated delay, a strategy designed not to prevent the American landing, but to make it so costly that the Americans would reconsider their plans for invading the Japanese home islands. Every beach, every hill, every cave would be transformed into a killing ground where American forces would be forced to pay in blood for every yard of volcanic rock. The obstacle plan for Iwo Jima differed fundamentally from European beach defenses. Where Rommel had relied on massive barriers to destroy landing craft before they reached the beach, Kurabayashi employed obstacles to channel American forces into predetermined kill zones where they could be destroyed by concentrated fire from concealed positions. The Japanese obstacles were designed to appear less formidable than they actually were, encouraging American commanders to commit large forces to areas where they could be trapped and destroyed. The beach obstacles on Iwo Jima's landing beaches consisted primarily of natural materials integrated with carefully concealed man-made barriers. Japanese engineers had spent months modifying the volcanic terrain, creating artificial defile, reinforcing natural cliff faces, and positioning thousands of mines and booby traps. Unlike the obvious steel and concrete barriers employed in Europe, the Iwo Jima obstacles were designed to blend with the natural terrain while creating equally effective barriers to movement. The most sophisticated obstacle system was developed for the approaches to Mount Suribachi, the dominant terrain feature on the southern end of the island. Japanese engineers created what appeared to be natural ravines and approaches leading toward the mountain, but these paths were actually carefully designed kill zones covered by interlocking fields of fire from concealed positions. Wire obstacles were minimal primarily because the rocky terrain provided natural barriers that were more effective than man-made entanglements. Where wire was employed, it was positioned underground or in concealed locations where it could not be detected by American reconnaissance. Japanese engineers had studied captured examples of American Bangalore torpedoes and understood their capabilities and limitations. The response was to create wire obstacles that were either too deep underground to be effectively breached by surface explosions, or positioned in multiple thin lines that would require numerous separate breaching operations. The most innovative Japanese obstacle technique involved what they called progressive channeling, a system of barriers that forced attacking forces to move in predictable patterns through a series of killing grounds. The initial obstacles would be relatively light, allowing American forces to breach them quickly and gain confidence. As the Americans advanced inland, the obstacles would become progressively more formidable, forcing them to bunch up in smaller areas where they could be engaged by concentrated fire. Captain Inoue Samaji, the 26th Tank Regiment's senior engineer officer, had been responsible for designing many of the obstacle systems protecting the approaches to Mount Suribachi. A graduate of the Imperial Army Engineering School, Inoue had studied American amphibious assault tactics and understood that American success depended on maintaining momentum during the initial landing phase. His obstacles were designed specifically to disrupt that momentum by creating what he called decision points, locations where American commanders would be forced to halt their advance and commit additional resources to overcome barriers. The first decision point was located approximately 200 yards inland from the landing beaches. American forces advancing from the beach would encounter what appeared to be a simple wire obstacle, a single line of barbed wire stretched between wooden posts. The obstacle could be easily breached using standard techniques, and most American units would probably assign a small team to clear it while the main body prepared to continue the advance. But when American engineers approached the wire line, they would discover that it was actually the outer edge of a complex three-dimensional obstacle system. The visible wire was connected to concealed tripwires that would detonate buried charges when disturbed. The wooden posts were actually camouflaged steel stakes that could not be cut with standard wire cutters. Most importantly, the entire area was registered for immediate mortar and artillery fire that would be called down the moment any American personnel were observed working on the obstacles. The Americans would be forced to commit additional resources, more engineers, more explosives, more covering fire to clear what had initially appeared to be a minor barrier. While they were focused on the obstacle clearing operation, Japanese observers would identify key personnel, communication equipment, and heavy weapons for targeting by sniper fire and indirect fire. The simple process of breaching one wire obstacle would become a complex tactical problem requiring significant time and resources to solve. Inouye's second decision point was positioned 500 yards inland, at the base of Mount Suribachi's main approach routes. Here, American forces would encounter obstacles that could not be bypassed or ignored. The terrain had been modified to create artificial choke points where natural ravines had been partially blocked with concrete barriers, steel obstacles, and massive boulders. The choke points were just wide enough to allow infantry movement in single file, but too narrow for vehicles or heavy equipment. Each choke point was covered by fire from multiple concealed positions and rigged with explosive charges that could seal the passage completely if necessary. More importantly, the areas immediately beyond the choke points had been prepared as killing grounds where American forces would be exposed to fire from three sides while having limited space to maneuver or take cover. The obstacles at the choke points could not be cleared using standard American techniques. Bangalore torpedoes were ineffective against solid concrete barriers and steel obstacles anchored deep in volcanic rock. Explosives in sufficient quantity to destroy the barriers would also collapse the passage, making it impassable for American forces. Manual clearing was possible, but would require engineers to work for hours under direct observation from Japanese positions. The psychological effect of Inouye's obstacle plan was as important as the physical barrier created. American forces accustomed to rapid advances and quick obstacle clearance would find themselves engaged in prolonged engineering operations under fire, suffering casualties among their most skilled and valuable personnel. The obstacles would force American commanders to choose between accepting heavy losses among engineer personnel or accepting delays that would disrupt the entire assault timeline. The reality of combat on Iwo Jima proved the effectiveness of the Japanese approach. When the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions landed on February 19, 1945, they initially made rapid progress against light opposition. The beach obstacles were easily cleared, and Marine units advanced several hundred yards inland within the first hour. But as they encountered Inouye's progressive obstacle system, their advance slowed dramatically. The first major obstacle clearing operation began at approximately 10:30 hours, when units of the 28th Marines encountered the wire barrier protecting the approaches to Mount Suribachi. Marine engineers approached the obstacle expecting routine clearance operations but immediately came under fire from concealed Japanese positions. The wire itself proved to be more substantial than anticipated, multiple lines of heavy-gauge steel cable that could not be cut with standard wire cutters. Attempts to breach the obstacle using Bangalore torpedoes were partially successful but revealed the true sophistication of the Japanese system. Each detonation triggered secondary explosions from concealed charges, and Japanese mortar fire was immediately directed at the breach points. More importantly, clearing one section of wire revealed additional obstacle lines that had been invisible from a distance. The obstacle clearing operation at Mount Suribachi ultimately required 6 hours and cost the 28th Marines 47 casualties, including 12 engineers killed or wounded. The breach was successful, but the delay allowed Japanese forces to reinforce their positions and prepared additional obstacles that would challenge American advances for the remainder of the battle. Similar patterns emerged across Iwo Jima as American forces encountered obstacle systems designed to maximize delay and casualties rather than prevent penetration entirely. The Japanese strategy proved devastatingly effective. The battle lasted 36 days instead of the 5 days originally planned by American commanders, and casualty rates among American engineers exceeded 50% in many units. Lieutenant Colonel Takechi Nishi of the 26th Tank Regiment, responsible for coordinating obstacle defenses in the northern sector of Iwo Jima, implemented similar tactics with even more sophisticated results. Nishi's background as an Olympic equestrian and international competitor had given him insight into Western tactical thinking that proved invaluable in designing obstacles that would frustrate American commanders. Nishi understood that American forces were trained to overcome obstacles through the application of overwhelming firepower and engineering resources. The American approach was fundamentally methodical: identify the obstacle, mass the resources needed to overcome it, execute the clearance operation, and continue the advance. This approach worked well against conventional obstacles, but could be disrupted by obstacles that changed their characteristics when attacked or that revealed additional complexities as clearance operations progressed. Nishi's signature innovation was the expanding obstacle barrier system that appeared simple when first encountered, but became progressively more complex as American forces attempted to clear it. The initial obstacle might be a simple wire entanglement that could be breached with a single Bangalore torpedo, but the detonation would reveal additional obstacles that had been concealed beneath the original barrier. Clearing the second obstacle would reveal a third, and so on, until what had originally appeared to be a minor delay became a major engineering project. The expanding obstacle technique was employed most effectively in the approaches to Hill 362, a key terrain feature in northern Iwo Jima. American forces first encountered what appeared to be a standard wire obstacle blocking a natural approach route. Marine engineers successfully breached the wire using Bangalore torpedoes, but the detonation revealed a concrete anti-tank wall that had been concealed behind the wire. Clearing the concrete barrier required additional explosives and engineering equipment, but revealed a minefield that extended across the entire approach route. Clearing the minefield revealed additional wire obstacles, then steel anti-vehicle barriers, then more mines. The Hill 362 approach ultimately required 4 separate obstacle clearing operations over a period of 12 hours, involving 3 different marine engineer companies and consuming enormous quantities of explosives and specialized equipment. The final breakthrough was successful, but the delay allowed Japanese defenders to reposition forces and establish new obstacles that would challenge the Marine advance for several additional days. The effectiveness of Japanese obstacle tactics on Iwo Jima influenced American planning for the invasion of Okinawa, scheduled for April 1, 1945. American intelligence analysts studied the Iwo Jima experience and concluded that Japanese forces had developed obstacle techniques specifically designed to counter American engineering capabilities, including the Bangalore torpedo and other specialized clearance equipment. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima surveyed the cave complex beneath Shuri Castle, studying the detailed maps that covered every wall of his underground command post. The date was March 28, 1945, and intelligence reports confirmed that the massive American invasion fleet was approaching Okinawa. Unlike his colleague Kurabayashi on Iwo Jima, Ushijima commanded not just a fortress island but an entire prefecture with a substantial civilian population and complex terrain that offered both opportunities and challenges for defensive operations. The lessons from Iwo Jima had arrived in the form of detailed reports from the few surviving Japanese officers who had witnessed American assault techniques firsthand. These reports confirmed what Ushijima had already suspected. American forces had developed sophisticated methods for breaching wire obstacles and concrete barriers, including explosive devices that could clear gaps through even heavily defended positions. The Bangalore torpedo, in particular, had proven devastatingly effective against traditional wire entanglements. Ushijima's response was to abandon traditional obstacle construction entirely. Instead of creating barriers designed to stop American forces, Japanese engineers would create maze-like obstacle complexes designed to separate American units from their supporting fires and channel them into areas where they could be destroyed by concentrated artillery and mortar fire. The obstacles would be integrated with the natural terrain to create a 3-dimensional defensive system that would force American forces to fight for every hill, every cave, every individual position. The cornerstone of Ushijima's defensive system was what Japanese planners called the Shuri Line, a series of mutually supporting defensive positions extending across the width of southern Okinawa. Unlike traditional linear defenses, the Shuri Line incorporated multiple layers of obstacles, firing positions, and command facilities, with each layer designed to continue fighting even if others were overrun. The obstacle plan was integral to this concept, ensuring that American forces could not simply bypass strong points but would be forced to reduce each position individually. Colonel Hiramichi Yahara, Ushijima's senior operations officer, had been responsible for developing the detailed obstacle plan for the Shuri Line. A graduate of the Army War College and veteran of campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, Yahara understood both the capabilities and limitations of American engineering techniques. His obstacle design reflected this knowledge in its emphasis on depth, complexity, and integration with defensive fires. Yahara's analysis of American engineering capabilities had identified several key vulnerabilities. American forces were extremely effective at clearing obstacles when they could mass resources and apply overwhelming firepower to specific points. However, they struggled when forced to clear multiple obstacles simultaneously across a wide front, especially when those obstacles were covered by fire and when clearing operations had to be conducted under direct observation from enemy positions. The Japanese obstacle plan for Okinawa exploited these vulnerabilities through what Yahara called distributed complexity. Instead of creating a few major obstacle belts that could be breached by concentrated American efforts, Japanese engineers created hundreds of smaller obstacle clusters scattered across the entire battlefield. Each cluster was relatively minor, perhaps 20 or 30 yards of wire, a small minefield, or a few concrete barriers, but collectively they would force American units to conduct obstacle clearing operations constantly, consuming resources and creating delays that would disrupt the American tactical timeline. More importantly, each obstacle cluster was positioned to support the others. American forces clearing one obstacle would immediately come under fire from positions protecting adjacent obstacles. Units committed to clearing operations in one location would be unable to support clearing operations elsewhere. The cumulative effect would be to force American commanders to choose between accepting unacceptable delays or accepting unacceptable casualties. The construction effort for the Okinawa obstacle system was unprecedented in scope. Unlike Iwo Jima, where Japanese forces had months to prepare limited terrain, Okinawa required obstacle construction across hundreds of square miles of varied terrain, including urban areas, agricultural land, and complex hill country. The work was conducted primarily by Okinawan civilians under Japanese military supervision, with materials ranging from concrete and steel to bamboo and local stone. The northern sector of the Shuri Line, protecting the approaches to Shuri Castle, incorporated the most sophisticated obstacle techniques. Japanese engineers created what appeared to be natural terrain features but were actually carefully constructed killing grounds. Streams were dammed and diverted to create muddy areas where American vehicles would bog down. Hills were scarped and terraced to create artificial cliff faces that would channel American movement into predetermined routes. Rice paddies were flooded and mined, forcing American forces to use elevated paths that could be easily targeted by Japanese artillery. Wire obstacles in the northern sector were positioned underground or in reverse slope positions where they could not be detected by American reconnaissance. When American forces encountered these obstacles, they would find that standard Bangalore torpedo techniques were ineffective because the wire was either too deep to be reached by surface explosions or positioned in locations where explosive clearance would create impassable craters or debris fields. The most innovative obstacle technique employed on Okinawa was what Japanese engineers called sequential revelation obstacle systems that disclosed their true complexity only after American forces had committed resources to clearing them. The initial obstacle might appear to be a simple wire entanglement blocking a road or trail. American engineers would successfully breach the wire using standard techniques, but would then discover that the road itself was mined, blocked by concealed barriers, or covered by fire from positions that had been invisible until the clearing operation began. Captain Koichi Ito of the 6th Engineering Regiment had been responsible for implementing sequential revelation techniques in the approaches to the town of Kakazu. A specialist in American tactical methods, Ito had studied captured American field manuals and training materials to understand how American forces approached obstacle clearing operations. His obstacles were designed specifically to exploit the methodical American approach by making each step in the clearing process reveal additional complications. Ito's signature obstacle was positioned at the entrance to Kakazu village, where the main approach road crossed a small stream. American forces approaching from the north would encounter what appeared to be a standard roadblock, several concrete barriers positioned across the road with wire obstacles extending into the adjacent fields. The barriers could be cleared using explosives, and the wire could be breached using Bangalore torpedoes. Most American commanders would assign a standard engineer team to clear the obstacle while the main body prepared to continue the advance. But when American engineers approached the concrete barriers, they would discover that the barriers were actually decoys, lightweight concrete shells positioned to conceal the real obstacles beneath them. Removing the false barriers would reveal steel anti-tank obstacles anchored deep in the roadway and surrounded by anti-personnel mines. Clearing the real barriers would require heavy equipment and extensive use of explosives, creating noise and dust that would alert Japanese defenders throughout the area. The wire obstacles extending from the roadblock were similarly deceptive. They appeared to be standard barbed wire entanglements that could be breached using Bangalore torpedoes, but the wire was actually camouflaged steel cable that would not fragment when subjected to explosive force. Attempts to breach the wire would fail, forcing American engineers to cut through the obstacles manually while under fire from concealed Japanese positions. Most importantly, the entire obstacle complex was rigged with remote-controlled explosive charges that could be detonated to seal the road completely if necessary. Japanese observers positioned on the surrounding hills could trigger these charges at any time, potentially trapping American forces in the kill zone or preventing them from exploiting any breach that had been successfully created. The Kakazu obstacle proved devastatingly effective when American forces first encountered it on April 9, 1945. Elements of the 96th Infantry Division approached the roadblock expecting routine clearance operations but found themselves engaged in a 12-hour battle that ultimately cost them 38 casualties and forced them to commit their entire divisional engineer battalion to clearing a single obstacle complex. Similar obstacles throughout the Shuri Line created cumulative delays that disrupted American operational plans and forced commanders to revise their estimates for completing the Okinawa campaign. What had originally been planned as a brief operation to secure airbases and harbors became a prolonged battle of attrition that lasted 82 days and cost American forces more casualties than the entire Iwo Jima campaign. The effectiveness of Japanese obstacle tactics on Okinawa represented the culmination of 2 years of tactical evolution in response to American amphibious assault capabilities. Japanese engineers had moved from attempting to stop American landings entirely to creating defensive systems that maximized American casualties and disrupted American operational timelines. The obstacles became less about preventing penetration and more about controlling the terms and costs of that penetration. Master Sergeant William Peck of the 7th Infantry Division's Engineer Battalion, a veteran of campaigns from Guadalcanal to Leyte, later wrote that the obstacles on Okinawa were like nothing we had encountered before. Every position had 3 or 4 backup plans, and clearing one obstacle just revealed another one that was worse. The Japanese had figured out exactly how we operated and designed everything to make our job as difficult and dangerous as possible. The Japanese approach proved so effective that it influenced American planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, scheduled for November 1945. Intelligence analysts concluded that Japanese forces had developed obstacle and defensive techniques that could make even a successful invasion extremely costly. These assessments contributed to the American decision to employ atomic weapons rather than proceed with Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. Colonel Hermann Bosch of the 71st Infantry Division stood on the heights above Cassino, studying the Allied positions through his field glasses. The date was February 8, 1944, and intelligence reports indicated that British and American forces were preparing for another assault on the Gustav Line. As the senior German engineer officer responsible for the Cassino sector, Bosch had spent months creating obstacle systems that would exploit the mountainous terrain to maximum advantage. The Italian campaign presented unique challenges for obstacle construction and employment. Unlike the relatively flat terrain of the Normandy beaches or the confined spaces of Pacific Islands, the Italian peninsula offered complex mountain terrain that naturally channeled movement along predictable routes. German engineers could not rely on massive beach obstacle belts or elaborate underground complexes. Instead, they had to create obstacle systems that would work with the terrain to create choke points where Allied forces could be stopped by relatively small numbers of defenders. Bosch understood that the key to successful mountain defense lay in controlling the limited number of routes that could support mechanized movement. Tanks, artillery, and supply vehicles were restricted to roads, valleys, and ridge lines that could be easily identified and targeted. If German forces could block these routes with obstacles that were difficult to clear under fire, they could force Allied forces to attack on foot across terrain that heavily favored the defense. The obstacle plan for the Gustav Line reflected this understanding. Instead of trying to create barriers across the entire front, German engineers concentrated their efforts on the dozen major routes that Allied forces would need to use for any successful advance. Each route was blocked by multiple obstacle systems designed to force Allied engineers to conduct lengthy clearing operations under direct observation from German positions. The most sophisticated obstacle system in the casino sector was constructed in the Liri Valley, the most obvious route for Allied mechanized forces advancing toward Rome. The valley floor was relatively flat and offered excellent routes for tanks and vehicles, but it was also completely dominated by German observation posts on the surrounding hills. Any obstacle clearing operation in the valley would be conducted under fire from multiple directions. German engineers under Boch's direction created what they called a linear killing ground, extending for approximately 2 miles along the valley floor. The obstacles were positioned in 3 groups, each located at a point where the valley narrowed and alternative routes were limited. The first obstacle group was designed to stop Allied forces and force them to commit engineer resources to clearing operations. The second group was positioned to catch Allied forces after they had successfully cleared the first obstacles but before they could reorganize for continued advance. The third group was the most formidable, designed to stop Allied forces that had already demonstrated their ability to overcome German obstacles. Each obstacle group incorporated multiple types of barriers integrated with the terrain and defensive fires. Anti-tank obstacles made from concrete and steel were positioned across roads, and in key terrain features where vehicles would be forced to pass. Wire obstacles extended from the anti-tank barriers to prevent infantry from bypassing the vehicle obstacles. Minefields covered the areas between obstacles and extended into adjacent terrain where Allied forces might attempt to find alternative routes. The first obstacle group at the entrance to the valley incorporated check hedgehogs and concrete pyramids positioned to block the main road while wire obstacles extended across the valley floor. The barriers appeared substantial but were actually designed to be clearable using standard Allied techniques. German engineers wanted Allied forces to commit resources to clearing the first obstacles and to gain confidence in their ability to overcome German defenses. But when Allied engineers began clearing operations against the first obstacles, they would come under fire from concealed German positions on both sides of the valley. More importantly, they would discover that the obstacles were more complex than they appeared. The concrete barriers incorporated steel reinforcement that made them resistant to explosive charges. The wire obstacles included multiple types of wire, some that could be cut easily and others made from steel cable that required special tools. Clearing the obstacles completely would require more time and resources than Allied planners had anticipated. The second obstacle group was positioned approximately 800 yards beyond the first, at a point where the valley floor was crossed by a small stream. German engineers had modified the stream crossing to create a natural choke point where vehicles would be forced to use a single ford while infantry would be channeled into predictable approach routes. The obstacles at this position were designed to appear minor simple wire entanglements and a few anti-tank obstacles but were actually integrated with prepared firing positions and registered artillery targets. When Allied forces reached the second obstacle group, they would typically be dispersed and disorganized from clearing the first obstacles. Engineer units would be low on explosives and specialized equipment. Infantry units would be spread across the valley floor, seeking cover and trying to provide security for the engineers. This was exactly the situation that German planners wanted Allied forces committed to a predictable location where they could be engaged by concentrated fires. The third obstacle group incorporated the most sophisticated defensive techniques available to German forces in 1944. Positioned where the valley began to narrow as it approached the hills around Cassino, this obstacle complex was designed to stop Allied advances that had already proven capable of overcoming German resistance. The obstacles could not be cleared using standard techniques and would require Allied forces to commit reserves, call for additional artillery support, and possibly reorganize their entire approach to the valley. The centerpiece of the third obstacle group was what German engineers called a Panzersperr, a continuous anti-tank barrier made from steel rails and concrete that extended completely across the valley floor and into the lower slopes of the adjacent hills. The Panzersperr could not be bypassed and was too massive to be destroyed by portable explosives. Clearing it would require heavy engineering equipment, extensive use of explosives, and probably direct fire from Allied tanks and artillery. Behind the Panzersperr, German engineers had constructed multiple lines of wire obstacles integrated with prepared fighting positions. The wire obstacles were positioned in depth, with each line separated by 50 to 100 yards. Even if Allied forces successfully breached the Panzerspare and the first wire line, they would immediately encounter additional obstacles while under fire from German infantry positions. The most innovative feature of the third obstacle group was its integration with German artillery fires. Every obstacle had been surveyed and registered as a potential target for German mortars and artillery. When Allied forces began clearing operations, German observers could immediately call for fires on the exact location where engineers were working. The obstacles were designed to force Allied personnel to cluster in specific areas where German fires would be most effective. Captain Friedrich Schultz of the 94th Infantry Regiment, responsible for coordinating defensive fires in the Liri Valley, had spent weeks refining the fire plan to maximize its effectiveness against Allied obstacle-clearing operations. Schultz understood that the key to stopping Allied advances lay not in preventing them from clearing obstacles, but in making the clearing process so costly that Allied commanders would seek alternative approaches. Schultz's fire plan divided the valley into numbered target areas, each corresponding to specific obstacle locations where Allied engineers would be forced to work. German mortar and artillery positions were registered on these target areas, allowing for immediate fires within minutes of a request from forward observers. More importantly, the fire plan included provisions for sequential targeting as Allied forces moved from one obstacle to the next. German fires would shift to engage them at their new location. The effectiveness of the German obstacle system in the Liri Valley was demonstrated during the Third Battle of Cassino in March 1944. Allied forces launched a coordinated attack involving 2 divisions and extensive artillery support, but were stopped by the German obstacles after advancing only 1,200 yards in 4 days of fighting. The obstacle-clearing operations cost Allied forces more than 200 engineer casualties and consumed enormous quantities of explosives and specialized equipment. British Colonel James Morrison of the 17th Field Company, Royal Engineers, later wrote that the German obstacles at Cassino represented the most sophisticated defensive system we encountered in the Italian campaign. Every obstacle was positioned to support the others, and clearing one position just revealed another that was even more difficult. The Germans had clearly studied our techniques and designed everything to make our job as difficult as possible. The success of the German obstacle system at Cassino influenced defensive planning throughout the Italian campaign. The Gothic Line, constructed in northern Italy during the summer of 1944, incorporated similar techniques on an even larger scale. German engineers created obstacle systems that exploited the mountainous terrain to channel Allied movement into predictable killing grounds while maximizing the resources required for successful clearing operations. Major General Harold Alexander, commanding Allied forces in Italy, ultimately concluded that frontal assaults against prepared German obstacle systems were prohibitively costly and began emphasizing flanking movements and alternative approaches. The German obstacles had achieved their primary purpose, forcing Allied commanders to adopt less efficient tactics and extending the duration of the Italian campaign far beyond original Allied estimates. The lessons learned from obstacle employment in the Italian campaign influenced both German and Allied tactical development for the remainder of the war. German forces applied similar techniques in the defense of the Rhine barrier and the approaches to Berlin, while Allied forces developed new obstacle-clearing techniques and equipment specifically designed to counter German defensive innovations. The Norflex Engineering Works in Leeds, England, had been producing agricultural equipment for 73 years when the Ministry of Supply placed an urgent order for 10,000 special demolition devices in March 1943. Plant manager William Hartwell had no experience with military ordnance production, but the technical specifications seemed straightforward enough. Steel tubes, explosive filling, and simple connecting hardware. What Hartwell could not have anticipated was that his small factory was about to become a crucial link in the supply chain supporting the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The transition from agricultural equipment to military ordnance production reflected the broader transformation of British industry during World War II. Factories throughout the United Kingdom were being converted to support the war effort, with manufacturers of everything from bicycles to kitchen appliances suddenly finding themselves producing ammunition, weapons, and specialized military equipment. The Bangalore Torpedo production program was just one element of this massive industrial mobilization, but it illustrated the complexity of supporting modern military operations. The specifications for the M1A1 Bangalore Torpedo, provided by American military engineers who had studied the original British design, were deceptively simple. Each torpedo section would be 5 feet long and 2.125 inches in diameter, fabricated from steel tubing with wall thickness of 0.125 inches. The ends would be threaded to accept connecting sleeves, and the interior would be filled with 9 pounds of explosive mixture consisting of 80% amytal and 20% TNT booster charges. Simple as the specifications appeared, manufacturing Bangalore torpedoes in quantity proved challenging for several reasons. The steel tubing had to meet precise dimensional tolerances to ensure that sections from different manufacturers could be used interchangeably. The threading had to be exact to prevent failures during field assembly under combat conditions. Most critically, the explosive filling process required specialized facilities and trained personnel who could handle military explosives safely while maintaining production schedules. Hartwell's first challenge was acquiring the raw materials needed for production. Steel was strictly rationed in wartime Britain, and priority was given to tank production, naval construction, and aircraft manufacturing. Obtaining allocation for steel tubing required extensive documentation and approval from multiple government agencies. The process took 6 weeks, during which Hartwell's engineers designed production tooling and trained workers in the specialized techniques required for military ordnance manufacturing. The explosive filling presented even greater challenges. Norfolk's engineering had no facilities for handling military explosives and lacked personnel trained in safe explosive handling procedures. The Ministry of Supply solution was to establish a separate explosive filling facility at a former textile mill 10 miles from Leeds, staffed by personnel transferred from ammunition factories in the Midlands. Raw torpedo sections would be manufactured at Norfolk's, then transported to the filling facility for completion. Production began in May 1943 with a target of producing 500 torpedo sections per week. The initial production runs revealed numerous technical problems that had not been apparent from the specifications. The steel tubing tended to split during the threading operation, requiring modifications to the machining process. The explosive filling procedure proved more complex than anticipated, with variations in filling density affecting the performance of individual torpedo sections. Quality control procedures had to be developed to ensure that each torpedo section would perform reliably under combat conditions. By July 1943, Norfolk's engineering had resolved most production problems and was consistently meeting weekly production targets. The factory employed 123 workers operating in 3 shifts, with production continuing around the clock 6 days per week. The workforce included skilled machinists, general laborers, and specialized explosive technicians, as well as quality control inspectors responsible for testing sample torpedo sections to ensure they met military specifications. The scale of Bangalore torpedo production expanded dramatically as planning for Operation Overlord intensified during the fall and winter of 1943. Intelligence estimates indicated that Allied forces would require more than 50,000 torpedo sections for the Normandy invasion, necessitating a massive increase in production capacity. The Ministry of Supply responded by expanding the Bangalore production program to include 12 additional factories throughout the United Kingdom. The expanded production program illustrated both the strengths and limitations of wartime industrial mobilization. British industry could rapidly convert civilian manufacturing capacity to military production, but the conversion process was complex and resource-intensive. Each new factory required machine tools, trained personnel, raw materials, and technical support. Coordinating production across multiple facilities required extensive planning and quality control procedures to ensure that torpedo sections manufactured at different locations would be compatible and reliable. Arthur Fleming, the Ministry of Supply official responsible for coordinating Bangalore torpedo production, maintained detailed records of the industrial effort required to support the program. Fleming's data showed that producing 50,000 torpedo sections required approximately 2,000 tons of steel tubing, 400 tons of explosive materials, and the full-time efforts of more than 1,500 factory workers for 8 months. The total cost, including facility modifications, equipment procurement, and quality control testing, exceeded £2.3 million. But the production challenges were not limited to the torpedo sections themselves. Each complete Bangalore torpedo required connecting sleeves, nose caps, blasting caps, safety fuse, and other accessories that had to be manufactured to equally precise specifications. The connecting sleeves were particularly critical because failures during field assembly could prevent engineers from creating torpedo assemblies of the required length. The Ministry of Supply established separate production contracts for each component, coordinating delivery schedules to ensure that complete torpedo kits would be available when needed. Transportation and storage presented additional challenges. Completed Bangalore torpedo sections could not be transported or stored with their explosive filling because of safety regulations and the risk of accidental detonation. The sections had to be transported separately from their explosive charges, then assembled at forward depots immediately before shipment to combat units. This required additional facilities, trained personnel, and complex logistics coordination to ensure that complete torpedoes would be available at the right place and time. The American production program for Bangalore torpedoes was even more ambitious than the British effort. The United States Army Ordnance Corps placed initial orders for 100,000 torpedo sections in February 1943, with provisions for additional orders if combat experience indicated that larger quantities would be needed. American industrial capacity was greater than British capacity, but the same fundamental challenges applied. Obtaining raw materials, converting civilian production facilities, training workers, and coordinating logistics across multiple suppliers. The primary American contractor for Bangalore torpedo production was Bendix Aviation Corporation, which operated manufacturing facilities in Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Bendix had experience with precision manufacturing for aircraft production, but had to develop entirely new procedures for explosive ordnance manufacturing. The company assigned senior engineer Robert McNeil to lead the Bangalore torpedo program, and McNeil's team spent 3 months developing production techniques that would meet military specifications while maintaining the safety standards required for explosive manufacturing. McNeil's approach differed from the British model in several important ways. Instead of manufacturing torpedo sections and explosive filling at separate facilities, Bendix established integrated production lines where all manufacturing operations could be conducted at single locations under centralized quality control. This reduced transportation requirements and simplified logistics, but required more extensive safety procedures and larger investments in specialized facilities. The Bendix production process began with precision machining of steel tubing to create torpedo sections meeting exact dimensional specifications. The machining operations were followed by threading, testing, and surface treatment to prevent corrosion during storage and transport. Explosive filling was conducted in separate buildings with specialized ventilation, safety systems, and explosion containment features designed to minimize the risk of accidents. Quality control procedures at Bendix were more extensive than those employed by British manufacturers. Each torpedo section was individually tested for dimensional accuracy, threading compatibility, and structural integrity. Sample sections from each production batch were subjected to live fire testing to ensure that explosive filling density and composition met specifications. The testing program consumed approximately 5% of total production, but provided confidence that torpedo sections delivered to combat units would perform reliably under field conditions. American production capacity proved crucial as the scale of Allied operations expanded beyond the original Normandy invasion plans. The success of D-Day led to additional amphibious operations in southern France, increased emphasis on Pacific theater operations, and planning for the invasion of Japan. Each new operation required additional Bangalore torpedoes, and American industry was able to expand production to meet these requirements while simultaneously supporting other urgent military programs. By the end of 1944, American factories had produced more than 300,000 Bangalore torpedo sections, far exceeding original Army requirements but providing the inventory needed to support expanded operations. The production program employed approximately 4,000 workers in specialized facilities and consumed raw materials that could have been used for other military programs, illustrating the enormous industrial effort required to support modern military operations. The effectiveness of Allied industrial production became apparent when compared to Axis production capabilities. German industry produced some obstacle-clearing equipment, including improvised devices similar to Bangalore torpedoes, but never achieved the standardization or production volumes that characterized Allied manufacturing. Japanese forces relied primarily on improvised explosive devices and captured Allied equipment for obstacle-clearing operations. The industrial capacity to produce specialized military equipment in quantity proved to be one of the decisive advantages that allowed Allied forces to sustain the complex logistical requirements of global warfare. Corporal Edwin Kowalczyk crouched in a shell hole 50 yards from the German wire, studying the obstacle through a German periscope captured during the previous day's fighting. The date was August 15, 1944, and the 28th Infantry Division was preparing to assault German positions defending the approaches to St. Vith in Belgium. Kowalczyk, a former automotive mechanic from Detroit assigned to the division's engineer battalion, had become the unit's informal expert on obstacle clearing after surviving 7 major assaults since D-Day. What troubled Kowalczyk was that the German wire in front of him was unlike anything described in the Army field manuals. Instead of standard barbed wire entanglements that could be breached using Bangalore torpedoes, the Germans had constructed a complex 3-dimensional obstacle incorporating multiple types of wire, steel cable, and what appeared to be some form of steel mesh designed to defeat explosive breaching attempts. Standard Bangalore torpedo techniques, which had proven effective on dozens of previous occasions, might not work against this new type of obstacle. The evolution of obstacle clearing techniques during World War II reflected the constant cycle of innovation and counter-innovation that characterized military technology development. As Allied forces developed more effective methods for breaching obstacles, Axis forces responded with more sophisticated obstacle designs. Engineers on both sides continuously modified equipment, tactics, and procedures based on combat experience, creating a rapid acceleration in technical development that compressed decades of peacetime innovation into months of wartime adaptation. Kowalczyk's problem illustrated the challenges facing combat engineers throughout the European theater during the final year of the war. German forces, increasingly pressed by Allied advances, had abandoned the massive obstacle constructions that characterized earlier defensive positions in favor of more sophisticated barriers designed specifically to defeat Allied clearing techniques. These new obstacles required innovative solutions that went beyond standard equipment and procedures. The obstacle facing the 28th Division incorporated several features specifically designed to counter Bangalore torpedoes. The primary wire component consisted of steel cable with tensile strength far exceeding that of standard barbed wire. When subjected to explosive force, the steel cable would stretch and deform rather than fragment, potentially surviving Bangalore torpedo detonations that would completely destroy conventional wire obstacles. Steel mesh panels were suspended between the cable supports, creating a flexible barrier that would absorb explosive energy while maintaining its integrity. More significantly, the German engineers had positioned the wire obstacles in multiple thin layers separated by distances of 10 to 15 feet. This arrangement was specifically designed to defeat the linear blast pattern of Bangalore torpedoes. Even if Allied engineers successfully breached the first layer of wire, they would immediately encounter additional layers that would require separate clearing operations. The cumulative effect would be to force Allied engineers to conduct multiple breaching operations under fire, increasing casualties and delays. Kowalczyk understood that conventional Bangalore torpedo employment would be ineffective against the German obstacle. His solution was to modify standard procedures using techniques developed through combat experience and informal experimentation. Instead of positioning a single Bangalore torpedo against the obstacle, Kowalczyk's team would employ multiple torpedoes simultaneously, with detonations timed to create overlapping blast effects that would be more likely to clear the entire obstacle system. The modified technique required careful preparation and coordination. Kowalczyk's team assembled 3 separate Bangalore torpedo trains, each consisting of 4 connected sections for a total length of 20 feet. The torpedoes were positioned parallel to each other approximately 6 feet apart, with the center torpedo aimed at the main wire supports while the outer torpedoes targeted the mesh panels and secondary supports. All 3 torpedoes would be detonated simultaneously using a single firing circuit, creating a blast effect approximately 18 feet wide. Preparation for the simultaneous detonation required 45 minutes of work under German observation, during which Kowalczyk's team came under intermittent sniper fire and mortar bombardment. 2 engineers were wounded during the preparation phase, but the team continued working while other infantry provided covering fire and smoke concealment. The technical challenge of coordinating 3 separate explosive trains while under fire illustrated the complexity of adapting standard techniques to meet battlefield requirements. The detonation occurred at 14:30 hours, creating a blast effect that exceeded Kowalczyk's expectations. All three wire layers were completely breached, and the steel mesh panels were torn into fragments that actually created additional gaps in the obstacle. The blast created a continuous opening approximately 25 feet wide, sufficient to allow infantry movement in company strength and wide enough to accommodate vehicle passage if necessary. But the success of Kowalczyk's modified technique came at significant cost. The simultaneous detonation consumed 12 Bangalore Torpedo sections, compared to the 3 or 4 sections typically required for standard obstacles. More importantly, the preparation time and coordination required made the technique unsuitable for situations where engineers were under heavy fire or when time was critical. The modified technique was effective but required resources and circumstances that might not always be available. Similar innovations were occurring throughout the European theater as combat engineers encountered German obstacles that exceeded the capabilities of standard equipment. British forces in Italy developed what they called tandem Bangalore techniques, where multiple torpedo trains were detonated in sequence to create cumulative effects against particularly stubborn obstacles. Canadian engineers in northwestern Europe experimented with combining Bangalore torpedoes with other explosive devices to create hybrid clearing techniques that could defeat obstacles incorporating both wire and solid barriers. The most significant innovation in Bangalore torpedo employment came from American engineers in the Pacific theater, where Japanese obstacle techniques required different solutions than those developed for European operations. Captain Henry Morrison of the 6th Marine Engineer Battalion developed what became known as the Morrison technique, a method for using Bangalore torpedoes against underground wire obstacles that could not be reached by surface explosions. Morrison's technique involved using conventional demolition charges to create access holes in the ground above buried wire obstacles, then inserting Bangalore torpedo sections into the holes to place explosive charges directly against the buried wire. The torpedo sections were modified by removing the nose caps and adding extension handles that allowed engineers to position the charges accurately while remaining in covered positions. The technique was more complex than standard Bangalore employment but proved effective against Japanese obstacles that were immune to conventional clearing methods. The innovation process was not limited to field modifications of existing equipment. Combat experience also drove the development of entirely new obstacle clearing devices designed to address specific problems that Bangalore torpedoes could not solve effectively. The British Army developed the Conger rocket-propelled explosive device, which could deliver larger explosive charges over longer distances than Bangalore torpedoes. American forces developed the Snake explosive device, which could clear paths through minefields and wire obstacles simultaneously. But the most important innovations involved integration of Bangalore torpedoes with other weapons and equipment to create combined arms obstacle clearing techniques. Engineers learned to coordinate Bangalore torpedo employment with tank fire, artillery bombardment, and air support to achieve effects that could not be obtained using explosives alone. These integrated techniques proved particularly effective against German positions in the Siegfried Line, where obstacles were integrated with concrete fortifications that required multiple types of weapons to neutralize. Technical Sergeant Michael Sullivan of the 5th Armored Division's Engineer Battalion developed one of the most effective integrated techniques during the assault on the Siegfried Line in February 1945. Sullivan's method involved using tank fire to destroy concrete obstacles and bunkers, followed by Bangalore torpedo attacks against wire barriers, followed by infantry assault with flamethrowers and satchel charges against remaining positions. The technique required precise coordination between multiple units but proved capable of reducing heavily fortified positions that had resisted conventional attacks. The success of integrated obstacle clearing techniques led to formal changes in American tactical doctrine during the final months of the war. Field Manual 515, Engineer Combat Operations, was revised in March 1945 to incorporate lessons learned from combat experience and to provide standardized procedures for the advanced techniques that had been developed by individual units. The revised manual included detailed instructions for simultaneous Bangalore employment, tandem techniques, integration with other weapons, and adaptation to specific types of obstacles. Similar doctrinal changes were occurring in British and Canadian forces, reflecting the rapid evolution of engineer tactics based on combat experience. The sharing of technical innovations among Allied forces accelerated the development process and ensured that effective techniques developed by one unit could be rapidly adopted by others facing similar challenges. The German response to Allied innovations was limited by increasing shortages of materials and personnel, but German engineers did develop some countermeasures to the new Allied techniques. German obstacles constructed during late 1944 and early 1945 incorporated features specifically designed to defeat simultaneous Bangalore employment, including explosive charges rigged to detonate when multiple breaches were detected. German forces also began using improvised obstacle materials, including steel rails, concrete rubble, and even abandoned vehicles that were more resistant to explosive clearing techniques than conventional wire barriers. The technological evolution of obstacle clearing during World War II illustrated the accelerated pace of military innovation under combat conditions. Techniques that would have required years of peacetime development and testing were developed, refined, and adopted within months. The Bangalore Torpedo, originally designed in 1912 for clearing simple wire obstacles, had evolved by 1945 into a versatile tool that could be adapted to defeat sophisticated defensive systems through innovative employment techniques and integration with other weapons. Private First Class James Benedetto pressed his face against the cold sand of Omaha Beach, listening to machine gun bullets crack overhead, while he tried to assemble the Bangalore torpedo sections scattered around him. 3 of his teammates were already dead, killed during the first 10 minutes after their landing craft grounded on the beach obstacles. The surviving engineers of Gap Assault Team 14 had 40 minutes to clear a 50-meter gap through the German wire, or the entire second wave of Allied forces would be trapped on the beach under fire. Benedetto, a 19-year-old from Newark whose father had emigrated from Italy in 1923, had volunteered for the Army Engineers because he thought the technical training would help him find better work after the war. He had excelled in demolitions training, showing a natural aptitude for calculating explosive charges and understanding the physics of obstacle clearing. But nothing in his training had prepared him for the reality of assembling explosive devices while under direct fire from enemy positions 50 yards away. The German machine gun position in Widerstandsnest 72 had a clear field of fire across the entire obstacle belt that Benedetto's team was supposed to clear. Every time one of the engineers raised his head or moved to retrieve scattered equipment, the machine gun would immediately engage. German mortar fire was also ranging in on the beach, with shells exploding in the surf and among the landing craft still attempting to reach the shore. The noise was overwhelming, the constant crack of rifle fire, the steady chatter of machine guns, the whistle and crash of artillery shells, and the screams of wounded men calling for medics. Benedetto had managed to recover 5 Bangalore torpedo sections from the scattered equipment, enough to clear the first wire line if he could assemble them properly and position them against the obstacle. But the connecting sleeves for the torpedo sections were scattered across 30 yards of beach, and several had been damaged by shell fragments or gunfire. One sleeve was completely destroyed, forcing Benedetto to improvise a connection using wire and tape that might not hold when the explosive was detonated. The technical challenge of assembling the Bangalore torpedo under combat conditions was complicated by the physical effects of fear and adrenaline. Benedetto's hands shook as he tried to thread the connecting sleeves, making it difficult to align the torpedo sections properly. His breathing was rapid and shallow, reducing his ability to focus on the precise work required for safe explosive handling. Most significantly, the constant awareness of enemy fire created enormous psychological pressure to rush the assembly process, increasing the risk of mistakes that could cause the torpedo to malfunction or detonate prematurely. Working with Benedetto was Corporal Robert Kowalski, a 22-year-old coal miner from Pennsylvania who had joined the engineers because his civilian experience with explosives made him a natural candidate for demolitions work. Kowalski had survived the landing with minor shrapnel wounds but remained effective as the team's senior demolitions expert. His job was to prepare the blasting caps and safety fuse while Benedetto assembled the torpedo sections, then to coordinate the final placement and detonation. Kowalski's experience with mining explosives proved invaluable under combat conditions. He understood that the key to safe explosive handling under pressure was to follow established procedures exactly, regardless of external circumstances. While German bullets cracked overhead and mortar shells exploded nearby, Kowalski methodically prepared the blasting cap, cut the safety fuse to the precise length required for a 60-second delay, and tested the firing circuit to ensure reliable detonation. The assembly process took 18 minutes, far longer than the 5 minutes specified in the training manual, but remarkably fast considering the circumstances. When the torpedo was ready for positioning, Benedetto and Kowalski had to crawl 30 yards across open beach to reach the wire obstacle, dragging the assembled explosive device while staying low enough to avoid machine gun fire. Two other engineers, Privates Anthony Martinez from Texas and David O'Brien from Boston, provided covering fire with their rifles and threw smoke grenades to conceal the movement. Positioning the Bangalore Torpedo against the wire obstacle required Benedetto to expose himself for approximately 20 seconds while he pushed the torpedo into the correct position and verified that the explosive charge was properly aligned. German machine gun fire immediately targeted his position, and bullets struck the sand within inches of his body. Martinez was hit by machine gun fire while trying to provide covering fire, taking a bullet through the shoulder that spun him around but did not prevent him from continuing to shoot at the German positions. The detonation occurred at 08:57 hours, creating a blast that was heard above the general noise of battle. The Bangalore Torpedo performed exactly as designed, fragmenting completely and clearing a gap approximately 12 meters wide through the German wire obstacle. But the success came at enormous cost. Martinez died from his wounds 30 seconds after the detonation, and O'Brien was hit by German mortar fire while moving through the cleared gap. Of the original 12-man Gap Assault Team 14, only 4 engineers remained effective after clearing a single obstacle. Benedetto survived the D-Day assault and continued serving with the 29th Infantry Division through the remainder of the European campaign. His personal records, preserved in division archives, document his participation in 17 major obstacle clearing operations between June 1944 and May 1945. Each operation cost casualties among the engineer personnel, and Benedetto was wounded 3 times by shell fragments near St. Vith in December 1944, by rifle fire during the Rhineland campaign in March 1945, and by mine explosion during the final advance into Germany in April 1945. Benedetto's experience was typical of American combat engineers throughout the European theater. The engineer casualty rate exceeded 30% in most units, significantly higher than the casualty rates for infantry or armor. Engineer personnel were routinely required to work in exposed positions under direct enemy fire, handling explosive devices that could kill them if improperly assembled or if struck by enemy fire. The technical nature of their work prevented them from taking cover during enemy attacks and made them priority targets for German snipers and machine gunners. The psychological stress of combat engineering work was particularly severe. Unlike infantry soldiers who could take cover during enemy attacks and who fought primarily with weapons designed to kill the enemy, engineers were required to continue technical work regardless of tactical circumstances. They had to maintain focus and manual dexterity while assembling explosive devices under fire, knowing that any mistake could result in their own death or the death of their teammates. Many engineers developed what military psychiatrists called demolition anxiety, a specific form of combat stress reaction related to handling explosives under dangerous conditions. Technical Sergeant William Morrison of the 1st Infantry Division, a veteran of campaigns from North Africa to the final assault on Germany, later wrote that the worst part wasn't the fear of being shot, although that was bad enough. The worst part was having to do precise technical work when you were scared out of your mind. You had to thread connecting sleeves and cut fuses and prepare blasting caps while people were shooting at you, and you knew that if you made a mistake you would blow yourself up along with anyone standing near you. The responsibility was incredible. Morrison's records document his participation in 43 separate obstacle clearing operations during 30 months of combat. He was wounded 7 times, received the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism during the Normandy campaign, and was promoted to Master Sergeant before being killed by German artillery fire 3 days before the end of the war in Europe. Morrison's case illustrated both the courage required for combat engineering work and the ultimate cost paid by many of the men who performed this specialized and dangerous mission. The individual stories of combat engineers revealed patterns that were consistent across different theaters and different armies. Engineers suffered disproportionately high casualty rates because their mission required them to work in exposed positions under fire. They developed strong unit cohesion because their survival depended on teamwork and mutual support under extremely dangerous conditions. They showed remarkable adaptability, developing innovative techniques and procedures based on combat experience rather than formal training. Most importantly, they demonstrated extraordinary courage and dedication, continuing to perform technically demanding work under conditions that would have been considered impossible in peacetime. The German perspective on combat engineering was similar in many respects. German combat engineers faced the same challenges of working with explosives under fire, adapting to changing tactical situations, and maintaining unit effectiveness despite heavy casualties. German engineer casualties were particularly severe during the final year of the war, when German forces were increasingly committed to defensive operations that required extensive obstacle construction and clearing under Allied air attack. Oberstfreiter Klaus Müller of the 6th Engineer Battalion, responsible for obstacle construction in the Siegfried Line during the winter of 1944 to 1945, kept detailed personal records of his unit's operations. Müller's diary documents the construction of wire obstacles, anti-tank barriers, and minefield installation under constant Allied artillery bombardment and air attack. German engineers worked primarily at night to avoid Allied observation, but were frequently caught in the open by Allied patrol activity or surprise attacks. Müller's unit suffered 67% casualties during 4 months of defensive operations, with most losses occurring during obstacle construction work rather than in direct combat with Allied forces. The technical demands of obstacle construction, combined with shortages of materials and equipment, created enormous stress for German engineer personnel who were expected to create effective defensive positions despite increasingly difficult circumstances. The experience of Japanese combat engineers in the Pacific Theater was different in important ways but showed similar patterns of high casualties and technical innovation under pressure. Japanese engineers faced the challenge of constructing underground defensive systems in extremely difficult terrain, often using improvised materials and equipment. The isolation of Japanese island garrisons meant that Japanese engineers could not rely on resupply or reinforcement, forcing them to develop self-sufficient techniques using locally available resources. Corporal Takashi Yamamoto of the 145th Infantry Regiment, responsible for obstacle construction on Iwo Jima, documented his unit's efforts to create defensive positions using sulfur, volcanic rock, and materials salvaged from destroyed equipment. Yamamoto's engineers constructed more than 2 miles of underground tunnels connecting firing positions, command posts, and supply areas, working entirely by hand with simple tools. The work was conducted under Allied bombing and naval bombardment that made surface activity extremely dangerous. Yamamoto was killed during the American assault on Mount Suribachi in February 1945, but his record survived and provided insight into the extraordinary dedication of Japanese engineer personnel, working under conditions that would have been considered impossible by peacetime standards. Japanese engineers created defensive systems that significantly exceeded American expectations and contributed to the prolonged and costly nature of Pacific Island battles. The human cost of combat engineering during World War II was enormous. American engineer casualties exceeded 15,000 killed and 40,000 wounded during 38 months of combat operations. British engineer casualties were proportionally similar, with Commonwealth forces suffering approximately 8,000 engineer deaths during 6 years of war. German engineer casualties are more difficult to calculate precisely, but available records suggest that German engineer losses exceeded 20,000 killed during the final 2 years of the war alone. These casualty figures represented not just statistical abstractions but individual human beings who had volunteered or been drafted for military service and who died or were wounded while performing some of the most dangerous and technically demanding work required by modern warfare. Their sacrifice made possible the success of major military operations, from the D-Day landings to the reduction of Japanese island fortresses, but came at enormous personal cost to the individuals involved and their families. The technical legacy of their work extended far beyond the immediate military applications. Combat engineers during World War II developed techniques and procedures that influenced post-war construction, mining, and demolition industries. The innovations in explosive handling, precision engineering, and work under dangerous conditions found applications in civilian occupations ranging from construction to space exploration. The organizational methods developed for coordinating complex technical work under pressure influenced management practices in industries requiring high reliability and safety standards. Most importantly, the individual courage and dedication demonstrated by combat engineers during World War II established standards for technical professionalism under extreme conditions that continued to influence military and civilian engineering throughout the post-war period. Their willingness to perform technically demanding work under life-threatening conditions, their ability to innovate and adapt to changing circumstances, and their commitment to mission accomplishment despite enormous personal risk provided examples that inspired subsequent generations of engineers facing their own technical and professional challenges. Colonel James Mitchell, United States Army Corps of Engineers, stood in the ruins of a German bunker complex near Aachen, examining the twisted remains of steel obstacles that had been cleared by American forces 4 months earlier. The date was March 20th, 1945, and Mitchell was leading a technical intelligence team tasked with documenting German obstacle construction techniques and evaluating the effectiveness of Allied countermeasures. The information collected would influence American military engineering doctrine for decades to come. Mitchell's team included specialists in demolitions, metallurgy, and defensive fortifications, supported by German prisoners of war who had been involved in obstacle construction and Allied combat engineers who had participated in clearing operations. The combined expertise allowed for detailed analysis not just of the physical characteristics of German obstacles, but also of the tactical and technical factors that determined the success or failure of obstacle clearing operations. The preliminary findings were sobering. German obstacle systems had proven far more effective than pre-war American doctrine had anticipated, forcing Allied engineers to develop new techniques and procedures under combat conditions. Standard American obstacle clearing equipment, including the Bangalore Torpedo, had been adequate for the mission but required modification and innovative employment to achieve maximum effectiveness. Most significantly, the casualties among Allied engineer personnel had been far higher than anticipated, suggesting that obstacle clearing under fire was inherently more dangerous and difficult than peacetime training had indicated. Mitchell's detailed analysis of Bangalore Torpedo employment revealed both strengths and limitations that had important implications for future military operations. The weapon had proven remarkably reliable in combat, with failure rates below 2% even under the most difficult conditions. The standardized design had allowed sections manufactured by different contractors to be used interchangeably, simplifying logistics and reducing supply problems. The simplicity of the device had made it possible for combat engineers to employ it effectively even under extreme stress and with minimal training. But the analysis also identified significant limitations. The linear blast pattern of the Bangalore Torpedo made it effective against wire obstacles but less useful against other types of barriers. The limited range of the weapon required engineers to approach within dangerous proximity of enemy positions, increasing casualties and limiting tactical flexibility. The explosive charge was insufficient to clear very heavy obstacles or to penetrate concrete barriers. Most importantly, the time required to assemble and position Bangalore torpedoes under fire was often longer than tactical circumstances allowed. These limitations had forced combat engineers to develop innovative employment techniques that went far beyond the original design parameters of the weapon. The simultaneous employment of multiple torpedoes, the integration of Bangalore attacks with other weapons, and the modification of standard procedures to meet specific battlefield conditions had all proven effective but required additional training, resources, and coordination. The innovations represented valuable tactical knowledge that needed to be incorporated into post-war doctrine and training. Mitchell's team also analyzed German obstacle construction techniques to understand why some barriers had been more effective than others. The most successful German obstacles had been those specifically designed to counter American clearing techniques, incorporating multiple layers, unusual materials, and integration with defensive fires. German engineers had clearly studied American methods and had adapted their obstacle designs accordingly. This cycle of innovation and counter-innovation suggested that obstacle construction and clearing would continue to evolve as opposing forces developed new techniques to defeat each other's systems. The technical intelligence collected by Mitchell's team contributed to a comprehensive post-war review of American obstacle clearing doctrine conducted by the Army Engineer Board at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The review, completed in December 1946, concluded that the Bangalore torpedo would remain an essential tool for combat engineers but recommended significant modifications to improve its effectiveness and reduce casualties during employment. The most important recommendation was the development of rocket-propelled versions of the Bangalore torpedo that could deliver explosive charges to target obstacles without requiring engineers to approach under direct fire. The British Army had already developed the Conger rocket-launched explosive device, and American engineers had experimented with similar systems during the final months of the war. The post-war development program would create standardized rocket-propelled obstacle-clearing systems that could achieve the same effects as Bangalore torpedoes while reducing exposure of personnel to enemy fire. The second major recommendation involved modifications to the basic Bangalore torpedo design to increase its effectiveness against improved obstacle systems. Larger explosive charges, enhanced fragmentation effects, and modular design concepts would allow engineers to adapt the weapon to specific types of obstacles encountered in combat. The standardized 5-foot sections would be supplemented with specialized warheads designed for specific applications, including anti-personnel obstacles, anti-vehicle barriers, and concrete fortifications. Training doctrine was also significantly revised based on combat experience. The pre-war emphasis on individual technical skills was supplemented with extensive team training that emphasized coordination under fire, innovative employment techniques, and integration with other weapons and units. Combat engineer training would include realistic simulation of battlefield conditions, including live fire exercises and training with actual explosive devices under simulated stress conditions. The evolution of the Bangalore torpedo during the post-war period reflected both the lessons learned from World War II combat and the changing nature of military operations during the Cold War. The development of nuclear weapons and mechanized warfare created new requirements for obstacle clearing that exceeded the capabilities of conventional explosive devices. Engineers might need to clear obstacles contaminated with radioactive materials, or to breach barriers constructed using new materials and techniques developed specifically to defeat known American clearing methods. The Korean War provided the first test of post-war obstacle clearing doctrine and equipment. American forces encountered Chinese and North Korean obstacle systems that incorporated lessons learned from World War II as well as innovations developed specifically for Asian conditions. The mountainous terrain and extreme weather conditions of Korea created additional challenges that had not been fully anticipated by post-war planners. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Harrison, commanding the 8th Army Engineer Battalion during the Korean War, reported that Chinese obstacle systems were more sophisticated and better integrated with defensive fires than anything we had seen in Europe or the Pacific. Chinese engineers had studied American obstacle clearing techniques and had designed barriers specifically to counter them. Wire obstacles were positioned in multiple thin layers that could not be cleared by single Bangalore torpedo detonations. Anti-personnel obstacles were rigged with secondary explosive devices that would detonate when clearing operations began. Most significantly, Chinese positions incorporated extensive tunnel systems that allowed defenders to move between obstacles and to replace cleared barriers rapidly. The response to Chinese obstacle innovations included further development of the Bangalore torpedo system and integration with new technology developed during the early Cold War period. Improved explosive compositions increased the effectiveness of individual torpedo sections while reducing weight and logistics requirements. Radio-controlled detonation systems allowed engineers to initiate Bangalore attacks from greater distances, reducing casualties and improving coordination with supporting fires. Most importantly, the development of armored engineering vehicles allowed Bangalore torpedoes to be delivered and positioned using mechanized equipment rather than requiring exposed personnel to approach obstacles under fire. The Vietnam War presented entirely different challenges that required further adaptation of obstacle clearing techniques. Vietnamese forces employed extensive tunnel systems, improvised obstacles constructed from local materials, and booby traps that were specifically designed to defeat American equipment and procedures. The jungle environment limited visibility and prevented the use of many conventional obstacle clearing techniques that required clear fields of fire and open terrain for maneuvering. Captain David Sullivan, commanding Company B, 65th Engineer Battalion, during operations in Vietnam, developed what became known as jungle Bangalore techniques specifically adapted to Southeast Asian conditions. Standard torpedo sections were modified to use smaller explosive charges that would clear vegetation and wire obstacles without creating excessive noise or revealing the location of clearing teams. The torpedo sections were shortened to improve maneuverability in dense vegetation, and special fusing systems were developed that could function reliably in high humidity and extreme heat. Sullivan's innovations proved effective but also illustrated the continuing evolution of obstacle clearing in response to changing battlefield conditions. Each new conflict revealed new challenges that required modification of existing equipment and development of new techniques. The basic concept of the Bangalore Torpedo, a linear explosive device for clearing wire obstacles, remained valid, but the specific implementation had to be continuously adapted to meet new requirements. The development of modern warfare during the late 20th century created additional requirements for obstacle clearing that extended far beyond the original Bangalore Torpedo design. Urban warfare required techniques for breaching concrete walls and steel barriers. Counter-terrorism operations required precision obstacle clearing that would minimize collateral damage. Peacekeeping operations required non-lethal obstacle clearing techniques that could remove barriers without creating permanent damage to civilian infrastructure. The response to these new requirements included development of the Advanced Performance Bangalore Torpedo, APBT, by British Chemring Energetics, which incorporated modern explosive technology and precision manufacturing to create a more effective and versatile obstacle clearing system. The APBT could clear wire obstacles more effectively than earlier designs, while also providing capability against steel barriers and concrete obstacles. The modular design allowed engineers to configure the system for specific applications, from minimum damage police operations to heavy-duty military obstacle clearing. American development of the Anti-Personnel Obstacle Breaching System, APOBS, represented a further evolution of the basic Bangalore concept, incorporating rocket propulsion to deliver clearing charges over longer distances while reducing exposure of personnel to enemy fire. The APOBS could clear paths several times longer than conventional Bangalore torpedoes while providing greater safety for the engineers employing the system. But perhaps the most significant evolution of obstacle clearing during the modern period has been the integration of Bangalore-type systems with robotics and remote-controlled technology. Modern battlefield robots can position explosive charges precisely while operators remain in protected locations miles away from the target obstacles. Unmanned ground vehicles can deliver clearing charges to target areas and initiate detonation without risking human personnel. Satellite navigation and precision guidance systems allow obstacle clearing operations to be conducted with accuracy that would have been impossible during World War II. Despite these technological advances, the basic principles developed during World War II combat remain relevant to modern obstacle clearing operations. The fundamental requirement to breach barriers that block military movement has not changed, and the physics of explosive obstacle clearing remain the same regardless of the sophistication of the delivery system. The courage and technical skill required of combat engineers continue to be essential elements of successful obstacle clearing, even when modern technology reduces some of the risks involved. The legacy of World War II obstacle clearing operations, and particularly the combat experience with Bangalore torpedoes, continues to influence military engineering training and doctrine. Modern combat engineers study the campaigns in Normandy, Italy, and the Pacific not just for historical interest but for practical lessons that remain relevant to current operations. The innovation and adaptation demonstrated by World War II engineers provide models for solving contemporary engineering challenges under combat conditions. Most importantly, the individual courage and technical competence demonstrated by engineers like James Benedetto, Robert Kowalski, Klaus Müller, and thousands of others establish standards for military engineering professionalism that continue to inspire current and future generations of combat engineers. Their willingness to perform technically demanding and extremely dangerous work under the most difficult conditions possible demonstrated that even the most sophisticated military technology ultimately depends on the skill, courage, and dedication of the individual soldiers who employ it in combat. The Bangalore Torpedo, invented by a British captain in India in 1912 and employed by combat engineers around the world during World War II, represents more than just a military engineering device. It symbolizes the continuous process of technical innovation and adaptation that characterizes modern warfare, and the extraordinary human courage and sacrifice required to employ that technology effectively under combat conditions. The lessons learned from its development and combat employment continue to influence military engineering and serve as reminders of the debt owed to the men who risked and often gave their lives to clear the obstacles that stood in the path of freedom and liberation. The morning sun broke through the gray clouds above Omaha Beach on June 7, 1944, casting long shadows across the scarred sand where the remnants of German wire obstacles lay twisted and broken. Staff Sergeant Frank Draper walked slowly through the gaps his team had blasted 24 hours earlier, counting the cost of their success. 12 men had landed with Gap Assault Team 12. 3 survived unwounded. The mathematics of liberation were written in blood and steel across 50 yards of Normandy sand. But those gaps, each exactly the width of a Bangalore torpedo's blast pattern, each precisely positioned to allow Allied forces to flow inland toward the liberation of Europe, represented something larger than the individual sacrifice required to create them. They represented the culmination of 32 years of military engineering evolution, from Captain McClintock's original innovation in British India to the industrial mobilization that produced 3.255 million torpedo sections in American factories. They represented the intersection of individual courage and technological capability that characterized the Allied victory in World War II. The story of the Bangalore Torpedo in World War II was fundamentally a story about problem-solving under pressure. When Rommel's engineers constructed the Atlantic Wall, Allied engineers responded with techniques for breaching it. When Japanese forces created underground defensive systems in the Pacific, American engineers developed methods for clearing obstacles that could not be reached by conventional means. When German forces in Italy constructed elaborate obstacle systems integrated with mountainous terrain, British engineers created new employment techniques that could overcome barriers previously considered impregnable. But the solutions were never purely technological. The effectiveness of the Bangalore torpedo depended as much on the courage and technical skill of the men who employed it as on the explosive characteristics of the device itself. Engineers like James Benedetto, who assembled explosive devices under machine gun fire on Omaha Beach, and Edwin Kowalczyk, who developed innovative techniques for defeating German obstacles in Belgium, represented the human element that transformed a simple steel tube filled with explosives into a weapon capable of breaking through Hitler's defensive lines. The industrial effort required to support Bangalore torpedo employment illustrated the broader mobilization of Allied resources that made victory possible. Factories throughout Britain and America converted from civilian production to manufacture specialized military equipment, training workers in techniques they had never seen before and coordinating logistics across thousands of miles and multiple theaters of operation. The £2.3 million spent by the British Ministry of Supply on Bangalore torpedo production was multiplied by similar expenditures on thousands of other military programs, creating an industrial capacity that Axis forces could not match. The tactical innovation demonstrated by combat engineers throughout the war showed the adaptability and creativity that characterized Allied military operations. When standard procedures proved inadequate, engineers developed new techniques based on combat experience and informal experimentation. When equipment limitations prevented them from accomplishing their missions, they modified existing devices or created entirely new approaches using available materials and local resources. The ability to adapt and innovate under combat conditions proved to be one of the decisive advantages that allowed Allied forces to overcome Axis defensive systems. The casualty rates among combat engineers, often exceeding 30% in units engaged in obstacle-clearing operations, reflected both the inherent dangers of their mission and the importance of their contribution to Allied success. Engineers were required to work in exposed positions under direct fire, handling explosive devices that could kill them if improperly employed, performing technically demanding tasks under conditions that would have been considered impossible in peacetime. Their willingness to accept these risks, and the sacrifice of those who paid the ultimate price, made possible the breaches that allowed Allied forces to advance toward victory. The effectiveness of the Bangalore torpedo against Axis obstacle systems demonstrated the fundamental principle that defensive barriers are only as strong as the will and capability of the forces attempting to breach them. German wire obstacles that appeared impregnable from a distance could be cleared by determined engineers willing to approach under fire and employ their explosives with precision and courage. Japanese underground positions that seemed impossible to assault could be reduced by engineers willing to develop new techniques and adapt their equipment to meet unprecedented challenges. The evolution of obstacle-clearing techniques during World War II also illustrated the continuous cycle of innovation and counter-innovation that characterized military technology development. As Allied forces developed more effective methods for breaching obstacles, Axis forces responded with more sophisticated barrier designs. As Axis forces created new types of obstacles, Allied forces developed new clearing techniques. The acceleration of this process under combat conditions compressed decades of peacetime development into months of wartime innovation, creating rapid advances in military engineering that influenced post-war technology development. The post-war analysis of Bangalore torpedo employment revealed both the strengths and limitations of the weapon system, while providing lessons that influenced military engineering doctrine for decades to come. The reliability and effectiveness of the basic design validated the original concept developed by Captain McClintock in 1912. The innovations in employment techniques developed by combat engineers demonstrated the importance of tactical flexibility and adaptation to battlefield conditions. The casualty costs of obstacle clearing operations emphasized the need for technological developments that could achieve similar effects while reducing exposure of personnel to enemy fire. The long-term influence of World War II obstacle clearing experience extended far beyond military applications. The techniques developed for working with explosives under dangerous conditions found applications in civilian mining, construction, and demolition industries. The organizational methods developed for coordinating complex technical operations under pressure influenced management practices in high-reliability industries ranging from aerospace to nuclear power. The standards for technical professionalism under extreme conditions established by combat engineers provided models that continue to influence engineering practice in both military and civilian contexts. Perhaps most importantly, the individual stories of courage and sacrifice demonstrated by combat engineers during World War II established human examples that continue to inspire subsequent generations facing their own professional and personal challenges. The willingness of men like Frank Draper to risk their lives to accomplish technically demanding missions under the most dangerous conditions possible demonstrated that even the most sophisticated technology ultimately depends on human courage, skill, and dedication. The Bangalore torpedo itself continued to evolve in the post-war period, with modern versions incorporating advanced explosive technology, precision manufacturing, and integration with remotely controlled systems. But the fundamental concept remained unchanged. A linear explosive device designed to clear wire obstacles by fragmenting steel pipe to cut through barriers that would otherwise block military movement. The physics of obstacle clearing and the tactical requirements for breaching defensive barriers remained constant despite advances in technology and changes in warfare. The men who carried Bangalore torpedoes across the beaches of Normandy, through the mountains of Italy, and onto the islands of the Pacific represented a generation that faced unprecedented challenges with courage, innovation, and determination. They were farmers and factory workers, mechanics and students, immigrants and native-born Americans who found themselves thrust into technical roles, requiring skills they had never imagined needing. They learned to handle military explosives under fire, to coordinate complex operations under pressure, and to continue functioning despite losses that would have paralyzed peacetime organizations. Their success made possible the liberation of Europe and the defeat of Japan, but came at enormous personal cost measured in thousands of individual tragedies: young men killed or wounded while performing dangerous technical work far from home, families devastated by losses that could never be fully understood by those who had not shared the experience, and survivors marked by memories of comrades who had paid the ultimate price for the freedom of others. The wire obstacles that blocked the paths of Allied forces during World War II were ultimately overcome not by the explosive power of the Bangalore torpedo alone, but by the combination of technological capability and human determination that the weapon represented. Each gap blasted through German wire on the beaches of Normandy, each path cleared through Japanese obstacles in the Pacific, each breach created in Italian mountain defenses represented the victory of human will over the barriers that tyrants had created to prevent liberation and freedom. The legacy of those engineers and their Bangalore torpedoes extends beyond the historical record of their accomplishments to the principles they demonstrated and the standards they established. Their willingness to adapt and innovate under pressure, their commitment to mission accomplishment despite personal risk, and their dedication to the technical excellence required for success under combat conditions continue to influence military engineering and serve as examples for current and future generations facing their own challenges and obstacles. Today, when military engineers encounter barriers that block the path toward peace and security, they carry with them not just modern technology and advanced training, but also the legacy of courage and technical competence established by their predecessors who carried Bangalore torpedoes through the wire obstacles of World War II. That legacy reminds them that obstacles, no matter how formidable they appear, can be overcome by the combination of technical skill, innovative thinking, and the courage to act when action is required. The steel tubes filled with explosives that blasted gaps through Hitler's Atlantic Wall were never just weapons, they were tools of liberation, instruments of freedom, and symbols of the human capacity to overcome any barrier that stands in the path of justice and peace. From Captain McClintock's workshop in Bangalore, India, to the factories of Detroit and Leeds, from the training grounds of England to the beaches of Normandy, from the mountains of Italy to the coral reefs of the Pacific, the Bangalore Torpedo represented the marriage of human ingenuity and human courage that defined the Allied victory in World War II. The wire has long since rusted away. The concrete barriers have crumbled. The beaches have been reclaimed by peaceful tides. But the legacy endures, written not in steel and explosive, but in the memory of men who faced the ultimate test of their technical skill and personal courage, and who did not fail when freedom itself depended on their success. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of the Bangalore Torpedo, that the most sophisticated technology is meaningless without the human will to employ it, that the strongest barriers can be breached when ordinary people find within themselves the extraordinary courage to act, and that the price of freedom is always paid by those willing to carry the tools of liberation forward into the teeth of the storm. The gaps they blasted remain open. The path they cleared leads forward, and their example lights the way for all who follow, carrying forward the unfinished work of human freedom, one obstacle at a time.